Why are the images of Helius, the Greek sun god, in synagogues from over 1,000 years ago? The synagogue in Capernaum, the town of Peter, when was it built? The synagogue in Magdala, the town of May Magdalene, has a beautifully carved stone in its center. What was it used for? Why can't we find synagogues from the 2nd century? These are some of the questions I'm going to be addressing in this video. It's the first in a series of lectures I gave on history and archaeology. This one I titled The Unsolved Mysteries of the Ancient Synagogues in the Land of Israel. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. I know this channel is mostly in Spanish, but I do occasionally publish some videos in English or with English subtitles. And if you like this one, please press like and leave a comment. Also, I should mention that in the description of the video, you can find a list of the pictures used in it that have some copyright restrictions. And now we can start. When we talk about the ancient synagogues of the land of Israel, what are we talking about? We should first say that I'm talking about the 1st century BCE all the way to the 900s. How many of those we have in Israel, or how many of those we have found or we know about, and where are they located in Israel? This website that has an interactive map, a map showing all the synagogues from that time period that we know about. It's interactive, so you can even mark to the right, you have some options. You see early Roman or Roman and Byzantine. Early Roman, we're talking about 63 BCE, all the way to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135. And Roman and Byzantine would be from 135 to the early 600s. But some of those synagogues that were built in the early 600s still existed, a few of them all the way to the 900s. Now, if you uncheck one of these boxes, here I checked the Roman and Byzantine and left only the early Roman, that means the oldest synagogues we have in the land of Israel, you see there's a lot fewer of them. And let's check the most ancient one that we know about, Jerusalem. Here in Jerusalem, some information about the synagogue in Jerusalem. This one was found in the city of David. Actually, the synagogue itself wasn't found. What they found is this Greek inscription saying Theodotus, son of so and so, built the synagogue and the guest rooms and the water cisterns. He was the chief of the synagogue, son of the chief of the synagogue, grandson of the chief of the synagogue. If this was from the 1st century, and whoever ran this synagogue, he was the grandson of the chief of the synagogue, that means that there was a former synagogue before that one, 2 generations before that, and we could say that it's from the 1st century BCE. So probably the oldest we know about, not the first one, but the oldest we know about. And again, I unmarked the later ones. You can see that the very oldest synagogues, just a few compared to the later ones. 2 reasons for that. One, the earliest synagogues, some of them are from the time that the temple in Jerusalem was still standing. You have to remember that the gathering place of Jews were not the synagogues, but the temple in Jerusalem. The way to worship wasn't prayers in the synagogue, but the offerings in the temple. For example, that inscription that we saw before, it also says that this synagogue was built for reading the scriptures and studying the law, which gives us a hint of what they used to do in synagogues. Those synagogues that existed alongside the temple, they weren't the place of worship, they were the place of study. Now, after the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, synagogues became sort of a replacement for the temple. Prayers became sort of a replacement for the offerings in the Temple of Jerusalem. Therefore, we need a lot more, and we have a lot more synagogues from after the temple was destroyed. Another thing you can easily see from looking at the map is that, well, most of them are in the north, you see? the Carmel Mount, the Galilee, the Golan Heights. Again, anyone wants to take a guess why that would be the case? Why all of them, most of them, compared to the ones we have in other areas?
Because they just emptied out Jerusalem and the Jews were all in the north of the country at the time.
Basically, yes. Mainly after Bar Kokhba. See, we usually think about the first revolt, the Great Revolt, the first war between the Jews and the Romans. That's like our biggest trauma, because the temple, Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. But the war that came 60 years later, the Bar Kokhba War, was even more deadly. Maybe after the Holocaust and very few other events in Jewish history, the one with the most casualties. And some argue that maybe 500,000 Jews died in Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, the Jews in the north, in the Galilee, in the Golan Heights, did not join the second revolt. Those communities survived, and therefore we had a lot more Jews from the 2nd century and on living in that area. Remember, when we think about the exile, the second exile and the second diaspora, we usually simplify and say the Romans in year 70 expelled the Jews and the Jews spread all around the world and there were no Jews left here, but it's actually was a much more gradual process. Many more Jews were killed or expelled 60 years later during the Bar Kokhba revolt, not all of them, and we continue having a Jewish presence in the lands of Israel continuously to this day. Many of those synagogues still existed all the way into the early Muslim period, and then we had earthquakes, economical crises, then the Jewish population started decaying even more, but it's not like Jews disappear from the land of Israel from one day to another, the way sometimes we simplify it. Another way to classify the different synagogues, the ones that were excavated and there was unexcavated. Unexcavated we know about because we found a few leftovers over the ground, but they weren't fully studied. And another one, religion, Jewish and Samaritan, you see? So other than the Jewish ones, if I close off the Jewish ones, you see a few ones that are synagogues belonging to the Samaritans. Now we have an idea what we're talking about. Let's start with the mysteries, the unsolved mysteries. And I start with the one that I find the most shocking. What is the Zodiac wheel and the Greek sun god doing in some of those synagogues? And let's see an example. Picture is from the synagogue at Hamat Tiberia, within today's Tiberia, and you see this wheel with the different zodiac signs, and in the middle, Helius, Greek and Roman sun god. And what is a pagan god, a pagan deity, doing in a Jewish synagogue? From here, we see it closer by. He's holding the moon. Not all of it survived. You see here there's a part missing. That's because later on someone built a wall on top of it. Another building built on top of this synagogue, which is approximate from the year 300 or so, maybe a little earlier, a little later. Well, and this is a reproduction to get a better view. You see also in the corners representations of the different seasons of the year. The mosaic floor is divided into 3 main panels. In the middle, we saw the wheel with Helius in the center. To the top, we see a representation of the Temple of Jerusalem. You see 2 menorot, one on each side, a shofar, a lulav, and an etrog. This would be the Arbat Aminim, 4 species. This shovel would be what they would use in the temple for the incense offerings. And this clearly represents the temple of Jerusalem. You even see in the middle the parochet, curtain that would cover the Holy of Holies. And this is another one, Bet Alpha, near Beit Shan. Also 3 panels in the center, the wheel. To the top, the same representation, very similar representation of the Temple of Jerusalem. And at the bottom, this would be Akedat Yitzchak, the sacrifice of Isaac. Here you see that the quality of the artwork is lower. Look at the lion, for example. nothing to do with what we saw before. By the way, these two places can be visited, and there's a national park in Hamativ area. There's a national park in Beit Alpha. When you go to Beit Alpha's national park, they have a movie. It's fictional, but they imagine the community gathering funds to build a mosaic, and they were a bit short. So instead of hiring the main artisan, they hire the apprentice. And that's why the level of the artwork is lower. We don't know that that's what happened, but here the Akedat Yitzhak, you can even read the word Abraham, Yitzhak, Batishlach, Eyal. Here you see them on the way to Mount Moriah. Here you see them already in Mount Moriah, and instead of Isaac, they sacrifice the lamb. A closer look to the representation of the temple. Same idea, very similar. Two menorot, again, the Arbat Aminim, again, shofar, again. Here we have also these two funny looking lions. A third and last one that I show you. This one is in Tzipori, also in the Galilee, a bit north from Nazareth. Here at the bottom, another Akedat Yitzhak. This one we cannot see because it didn't survive, but from the very little that survived, we think that these are the angels appearing to Abraham, letting him know that his wife Sarah was going to give birth. And you see the same wheel, but here, an interesting difference. You don't see the sun god himself, you just see the sun and the moon. You still see the chariot. In Greek and Roman mythology, the sun god would go around earth in a chariot pulled by horses, and you still see the chariot, but here they were careful not to depict the pagan deity, but the motif is the same, the zodiac wheels, and in the middle the sun god. To the top, another depiction of the temple of Jerusalem, this one a more detailed one. At the very top, again, two menorot, a shofar, and the Holy of Holies in the center. We have some additional elements in this one, like here we have the Bama, a sacrifice altar, some animals to be sacrificed, offerings being brought to the temple, but still, same idea. At the top, the temple, in the middle, the wheel, at the bottom, we have Avram and Isaac. Summing up, what do we know about this art motif that we found on those synagogues? We know it's found in at least 7 synagogues. And I say at least because in some cases it's not clear, just a little piece left. In some of them, like En Gedi, you don't see the wheel, but you see inscriptions with the names of the zodiac signs. Doesn't sound that many if you remember that we saw in the map 136, but it's quite a lot if you consider that there those 6 or 7 are spread everywhere. We have them in the Galilee, Jordan Valley, to the south of Hebron, one near the Dead Sea. We have them in cities, we have them in the countryside, and they span a very long time period. The earliest examples are from the 300s, the later examples are from the 600s. So this was a very prevalent motif in Jewish synagogues, although we do find the image of the sun god with the zodiac signs around him in other pagan examples outside of the land of Israel. Within the land of Israel, we find it only in Jewish synagogues. There are none in the Samaritan synagogues. It's not something you can find in churches. It's not something you can find in pagan shrines either. This was specific to synagogues. This was specific to Jews and to Jews in the land of Israel, because we haven't found any examples in synagogues that we know of outside of the land of Israel. It's very central. We saw in each case 3 panels, and this is the largest one and the one in the center. Different levels of depiction. What I mean by that, we saw that in one case we saw the sun god himself. In another case, they were more careful not to violate, or what you would think would be a violation of the second commandment from the 10 commandments: you shall not have images before me. Apparently some communities were a little more strict or more lax in their understanding of this idea. In the case of Egedi, we have only the wars. In the case of Tzipori, we have the sun, but not the sun god. And the case of Tiberius, where we have the sun god himself. And what does this all mean? What does this art motif mean in those synagogues? And again, anyone would like to take a guess? Your guesses are just as good as mine. And this is an unsolved mystery. We can't really know. We didn't find any written source mentioning those or explaining what they thought. So the leading theory would be, and I will go to one where you can see all three panels at once. Here, for example, now, if we have Akedat Yitzhak, the sacrifice of Isaac, at the bottom, and the temple at the top, maybe the wheel of the Zodiac and the sun god that also represent how the day becomes night and the night becomes day again, and the wheel of the Zodiac, this is the pass of time, the cosmic order, God's plan that starts with the promise to the Jewish people, then time passes, and at the end, we get the temple, the third temple that one day is going to be rebuilt. So the promise, time in between, and the fulfillment of the promise with the building of the third temple. But again, that's just a guess. The answer is that we don't really know. To the next one, the Magdala Stone. Magdala was a town by the shores of the Sea of Galilee, not far from Tiberias. 2006, not so long ago, first century synagogue was found, meaning a synagogue from the times that the temple was still standing, one of the few that we found from that time period. And in the middle, right in the center of the synagogue, this one stone that we call the Magdala Stone. By the way, this is a picture of the reproduction. The original one at the moment is being displayed in the Davidson Archaeological Park in Jerusalem, not far from the Kotel. Why is this a mystery? Because we haven't found anything like it anywhere else. Archaeology is science. It's not an exact science, and it's a science that works by comparison. If we find something somewhere, and we had that something somewhere else, and that's somewhere else, we know what it is. When we find it again, we can try to deduce what it is from those similar things that we know from other places or time periods. But this stone in the middle of a synagogue, we don't have another example. What you see here, it's another depiction of the Temple of Jerusalem. You see here the menorah in the center. These two jars made with water or oil to use in the temple. Here the bama, it looks like it's under the menorah. That's because this artwork doesn't have perspective, and the menorah would be behind it, and the altar would be forward, but still, it's the altar in the Temple of Jerusalem. The columns at the entrance to the temple, the two famous columns, maybe those other columns around it. Here in the top, many guesses about what each one of these motifs might be, but again, we are not really sure. And here you see the back also, these two wheels, again, maybe the chariot of Elijah, we don't really know. Here you see it much more clear, the altar and the menorah. What we do know that this is a representation of the Temple of Jerusalem. And what makes this one more special, I would say, than the ones that we saw in the other pictures of the later synagogues, that this one, it's from the times that the temple was still standing. The city of Magdala was one of the cities of the Galilee that did rebel against the Romans during the first rebellion, and from 66 to 70. Josephus Flavius tells us how he fortified the town. Again, this is a place that you can visit, and there are you can see the fortifications. He didn't really fortify the city. He built barricades, but still, the city was destroyed in 67 by the Romans, right at the beginning of the rebellion, and never built again. So here we can tell that this is from before the temple was destroyed, at the very least 3 years before the temple was destroyed. This is one of the only, not the only one, but one of the very few representations of the Temple of Jerusalem from the time that the temple was still standing. Now, the question is, we can guess what the artwork means, but it was in the middle of the synagogue. What was the practical use of the stone? There are many theories. When we have many theories, it's that we don't really know. Some suggest that maybe this would be like a bama in the synagogues that we have today. Today we unscroll the Torah scrolls on the bama in order to read. Maybe this is where they unscroll the individual scrolls to be laid on top of the stone to be read. But it seems quite uncomfortable because it meant that the rabbi or whoever was reading would have to kneel to read. And we know from other sources when they read, they would read standing. So other people say, based on the leftovers here in the corners, that maybe this was supporting a bama from another material that didn't survive. Others say maybe this would be the honor chair where the rabbi would sit while reading. But again, that would be quite uncomfortable. And again, we think that probably they read while standing. Remember, they used to read from scrolls and not from books yet. The one that I find more convincing is that here they just left the scrolls and the rabbi would come, pick one up, read, and then put them again and leave them in display in the middle of the synagogue while the synagogue was being used. Not all the time, because there's another room in that synagogue where we think that's where they kept the scrolls most of the time. But any guess is as good as any. We don't really know.
I'm just wondering what the dimensions are.
The dimensions, thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, you don't really see it from the picture. 60 centimeters long, 50 centimeters wide, and 40 centimeters tall. And since the top, it's a little bit convex, not flat, slightly convex, maybe it was used to hold the scrolls. Not far from Magdala, still by the shores of the Sea of Galilee, another synagogue, the synagogue in Capernaum. And this one is probably one of the most visited ones in Israel, mostly by Christians, because it's mentioned in the New Testament. Well, the one in Magdala also visited a lot by Christians because Magdala is where Mary Magdalene was from. That's why she was called Mary Magdalene. In better times, these places are quite crowded. Magdala is newer and not as well known yet as the one in Capernaum. Very interesting place for Jews, also worth a visit, undoubtedly to see our ancient synagogues. And the one in Capernaum, when was it built? There are several methods to try to date a synagogue or any other ancient buildings. The first attempt, two German scholars that were here in the middle of World War I, 1916. They came from today's Lebanon and Syria. They were studying Roman temples in the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, by comparing the ornaments, the decoration of these synagogues compared to the decoration style of those temples. They reached the conclusion that they are from the same time period, and this synagogue is from the 2nd century. And that was the accepted notion all the way to the late 60s. When they found it, you couldn't see it as you see it in this picture. It was mostly rubble. Here, it's after it has been partially reconstructed. The land was bought by the Franciscan order, a monastic order in the Catholic Church. They partially rebuilt And the synagogue, again, it's an important place for them because Jesus preached right there, and in Capernaum, he lived part of his life. This might be the one where he taught. So they saw the rubble, they saw second century, rebuilt it, and then in the late 60s, they excavated under the synagogue. They wanted to find the earlier synagogue, the one from the times of Jesus. What they did find under the floor of the synagogue were coins. Now, coins are a much more precise method for dating because you can tell when the coin was issued. Now, if the coin is under the floor must have been built after the date the coin was issued. And the problem is that they found many coins from the 500s and the early 600s. And this is when we start a 30-year-long argument among scholars. Is it from the 2nd century based on the ornaments, or is it from the 600s based on the coins? And the ones that favor the 2nd century said, well, those coins, maybe they are from later repairs, but I don't think so, because look at the columns here. Those columns, by the way, those are pieces of the columns, and the columns were much longer, and they are on top of pedestals, and those pedestals are on top of another rock, and only under that some of the coins were found. So they wouldn't lift a whole column for repairs. You have to think that this is the first floor. The synagogue had 2 floors. It's a huge, huge synagogue, 6 meters tall, just the first floor. They had a second floor, another 6 meters, maybe the Ezrat Nashim, the area for women. We don't know, possibly. So taking off a whole column from the first floor for repairs, not very likely. But another thing that isn't likely, in the 600, you would build in the style of the 100s. They didn't have neo. Today we have neoclassical, neo-Romanesque, neo-Gothic, and we build in the styles of the past. They didn't do that back then. You would not build in the 6th century in the style of the 2nd. That's not something that they would do. Yeah? The style would evolve, and they wouldn't go, let's bring back the old trend. No, they didn't do that. So that's why it was difficult to figure out how to explain the mismatch between the style and the coins. Look, this is another view from the top. It had this is the synagogue itself, and here some sort of patio attached to it was part of it, maybe a Beit Midrash, a place of study. By the way, if you stand in the synagogue and you look towards the entrance, you will be looking towards Jerusalem. Unlike the synagogue in Magdala, the first synagogues weren't yet designed to point to Jerusalem. At this time period, most synagogues point to Jerusalem. That's why we know that it's a synagogue, for example. That's one of the ways we know that it's not a church. Design, the basilica style design, it's not very different from that of churches from the same time period. Now, here, this one is not an unsolved mystery. About 30 years ago, scholars did come to an agreement that explains the discrepancy. And the answer to the question, is it from the 2nd century? Is it from the late 6th century? The answer is both. How is that possible? Apparently, this synagogue, and there are other cases, was first built in the 2nd century, somewhere else, not where it's placed now, disassembled and reassembled in Capernaum. Another thing to show it, look at the color of the synagogue. You see yellowish. This would be limestone, and all around those black stones, that's basalt, volcanic rock. We have plenty of synagogues in that area built with this volcanic rock. It's just as good to build synagogues. Why bring stone from at least 50 kilometers distance for the closest limestone? If you had a stone just as good right there. This was built somewhere where they did have limestone and reassembled. Here, another decoration belonging to the synagogue. According to the signs in the site, this would be a representation of the Ark of the Covenant. I disagree. I think that the Franciscans are wrong on this one. They are not considering whatever was missing in this part, because this rock is not full. There's something missing here. And I would guess that wherever is here is symmetrical to what we see on the other side. So we would see other columns on this side, and this is a gate, and this is another representation of the temple. That's my guess. The problem with my guess is, what are these wheels doing under it? And these wheels are the thing that made the Franciscans guess that this would be the Ark of the Covenant when it was being moved from the Philistine areas to Beth-Shemesh and so on. And this is connected to the other question: why can't we find synagogues from the 2nd century? We have plenty of synagogues, not plenty, we have a few from the 1st century, like the one we saw from Magdala, and we have plenty from the late 200s and on, like the other ones we saw. And we don't have synagogues from the 100s. What happened to them? And these two questions are connected. Look, this synagogue, this is Baram, also Galilee, and this one looks like a badly assembled Lego. Now, if you look at it closer, look at this gate here. Look at this piece at the top. It doesn't match the one to the side. You see this stone coming into it, okay? They don't match. And you see that they are in pieces rather than one big piece. Here also, you see that it was cut in pieces and put together. Here it's a little far and we don't see it, but this window, it's not properly centered and aligned. Also this one, here you see it better, not properly centered and aligned to this gate. So it looks like this synagogue was just badly built. What we guess is this one, and the same happened to the one in Capernaum, was built elsewhere, dismantled and rebuilt here. And there might have been some reasons to do that. We think that at some point the Byzantines, the Christian government from the 4th to the 7th century, at one point forbade building new synagogues. And the way around it was, okay, we didn't build a new one, we just reused an old one. Also, reusing an old one a lot cheaper than building one anew. And this is a time where there isn't state funding. The state is Christian, and there are two instances in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, where rabbis are asked, are we allowed to reuse? Are we allowed to build a synagogue with parts of other synagogues? So from that, we can guess that that was a somewhat common practice to build synagogues from parts of former synagogues. That would explain why we don't have synagogues from the 2nd century. Of course, another reason is those many of those must have been destroyed during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and those that survived, maybe they were made bigger later on, and we can't really find the leftovers from before. Maybe were just simpler than the ones we had before or after, and therefore we do have them, but we can't tell them apart from other regular buildings. So this is another unsolved questions. But yeah, we're missing 100 years of synagogues in those 1,000 years that we spoke about. Those were the topics I wanted to talk about today. Before we go, something more related to those synagogues and also to current events. Look at this one, mosaic from the synagogue in Gaza, also found in the early 20th century. We see David here. We know that he's David because he's playing the harp, and also because it says David up here. We don't know what the lion is doing. He's missing the face. That means that probably someone who felt that prophets should not be depicted decided to erase it. So that this what we call iconoclasticism, the erase of icons of human figures was something that happened at some points in Christianity, but mainly in Islam. So probably the Muslims at some point erased David's face because they didn't agree to represent what it's for them. He's a prophet as well. And this one over here, this one is from a synagogue near a kibbutz, also in the Galilee, called Huqoq. Last time I checked, they were still investigating and they haven't finished excavation. They excavate a bit every summer, then they cover it again, and then they come again the next summer to continue the excavation. So this is not something that you can actually see if you go to the place. It's probably covered underground unless you go precisely and they are again excavating. And that's Samson. That's Samson carrying the gates of Gaza. Hopefully, as Samson brought the gates from Gaza, hopefully we get our people back from there soon. One last one. And this one is also from Huqoq. We saw Samson, and we think they also had a wheel of Zodiac over there, although not clear because only very few pieces left. And around they had some stories from the Tanakh, like the one from Samson. This one here, we don't know. I don't know if any of you read in the Tanakh about any battle involving war elephants. You see the war elephants here? And who are these people dressed in white with an H? That wouldn't be an H, would be a letter in the Greek alphabet. Maybe, even though it's not in the Tanakh, maybe the Hasmoneans fighting the Greek, although the Greeks didn't have war elephants, so we don't know. Some people say maybe this is the great priest, Shimon HaTzadik, receiving Alexander the Great. But I don't know, these people are
people hostile to Jews.
It looks like a battle that's about to start. So maybe one of the battles of the book of Maccabees, that's not part of the Tanakh, but still a part of our history. Again, this one, another one that we don't really know.
If I could, I'm wondering about the shul that you just showed now in Gaza. Is it like, where is it in Gaza? Is it being?
That's a very good question. That mosaic, and that's just one piece, that's a very impressive mosaic that can be seen, not in Gaza, of course, in the Good Samaritan Museum. The Good Samaritan Museum is a museum that's halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho, or when you go from Jerusalem towards the Dead Sea, they gather on the mosaic from Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, not just from Gaza. Those that we would prefer not to live in places where might feel compelled to damage those. I'm trying to be politically correct. Now they are displayed, and that's another place that's certainly just less than half an hour from Jerusalem. So yeah, worth a visit, certainly.
Another question?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the Romans must have been involved in prohibitions against building new synagogues. I'm asking, do we know about Roman prohibitions that would cause?
Yes and no. Not the Romans, but the Byzantines. And the Byzantines are basically the Romans after they converted to Christianity. We don't know of any prohibition while the Romans were pagans. The Romans did not have problem with synagogues. They didn't have a problem with the temple in Jerusalem. They have a problem with insurrection. There were brief periods of times where before the Bar Kokhba rebellion, it seems that they forbade circumcision, Torah study, big question marks, what of that happened and how it actually happened. Circumcision makes a lot of sense. From the Roman perspective, it was sacrilegious to cut one's body in the times leading to the revolt. But was it that what prompted the revolt, or was that a punishment after the revolt? Maybe I find it hard to believe that they forbade the rebuilding of synagogues, because it does look like the communities, the Jewish communities in the Galilee, kept growing and flourishing. Those who did not participate in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and Sipori, it's a good example, they had quite cultural, artistic golden age in the late Roman period. Some of it is what we see in those synagogues. So I don't think so.
Thank you.
We have more questions than answers when it comes to history and archaeology.
Shabbat shalom to
Shabbat
everybody.
shalom.